Welcome to the University of Dallas's President's Day event. This is being sponsored by the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, ISI, which is a conservative intellectual organization that has been around almost as long as the University of Dallas. It was founded in the 1950s by William F. Buckley, and the emphasis of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute for the past 75 years has been emphasizing what is distinctive about the American regime, the American political regime, the American founding, and particularly what it owes to its classical and Christian roots. And I think a big part of that emphasis that those of you who have had me for American Civilization I know is this big question of what makes the American Revolution very different from the French Revolution. And when we look at the American founders, and there's always a kind of spectrum of American founders, you have the big six, but then beyond them, you have all of the people who ratified the Constitution. You have all of the people who fought in the American Revolution in the Continental Army. So there's a broad spectrum of the American founding generation. But amongst them all, there is George Washington, the man with the tallest obelisk on planet Earth. So there is definitely one founder among the many founders. Right? The other founders referred to him as the Pater Patriae, the father of his fatherland. And we celebrate President's Day in between the birthday of Lincoln and the birthday of George Washington. Last year, we had a speech about Lincoln. So this year, America 250, Washington gets his due. So to talk to us about Washington as founder, as statesman, as someone who built the regime that we are a part of, and I think that you guys here at the University of Dallas do think in terms of regimes, right? Do think in terms of a city that has shaped your soul and shapes the soul of all citizens, and also thinking about how the moral formation of your soul can also solidify and shape the city and its regime, right? And I think that also, because you have been studying in Rome, you have a good sense of just how important that word, both in Latin and in Italian, fondatore, right? A founder, right? That a founder is a very important person. He establishes an order, right? That's going to shape things beyond his own lifetime. A fondatore, right? So here, to speak to us about George Washington, we have Matthew J. Peterson, who is, in some sense, I would say, one of our own. He did not go to the University of Dallas, but he went to one of our cousin schools, right? One of the many schools that have tried to revive a Catholic liberal arts education in the 20th century. He went to TAC, to Thomas Aquinas College in California. That's why we know his heart is our own, right? He's one of our own. He went on to study at the Claremont Institute, and since then, he has really been working at the crossroads of politics, culture, and economy, right? Looking at how corporations and our cultural institutions, whether it's newspapers, whether it's movies, whether it's our entertainment, right? How that shapes our regime, and that we need to pay attention to it, right? We can't think that just going to vote once a year is going to do the trick, right? We need to continue shaping this country. And he's really been working at that in a number of different fields. For a while, he was the, I would say almost the founding editor-in-chief of The Blaze. And now he's working full-time for the Claremont Institute. So welcome, Matthew Peterson.
Thank you also to ISI. It's a great organization. Johnny Burka is a great human and a patriotic American. And thank you to Susan for that wonderful introduction. I think that all of you are patriots for being here on this occasion and giving some of your time on President's Day to honor George Washington. And I want to emphasize this before I start, that this is not, to me, a talk that's historical. We'll talk about history, but this isn't some historical enterprise. This is actually a talk given about the future. And as we stand here on President's Day today, and we look about the current political scene and cultural scene, you kind of have two sides. I don't like to use the words right and left anymore. I don't really know what they mean at this point. But you do have a progressive line of thought that you would call left-leaning that has spoken for a long time, over a century, about how regimes progress, they evolve throughout the arc of history. And when they do so, Woodrow Wilson to Barack Obama being preeminent members of this school of thought, when they do so, great leaders emerge who interpret history for all their fellow citizens and evolve the regime form of the country. It's sort of fluid. Wilson complained famously that the founders were out of touch. The way they saw the world, the way they saw the natural world and human nature was Newtonian, and we had learned that things evolve, and so the form of the regime must change, and this is, of course, a good thing. On the right, we have a sort of contradiction, I would say. Because on the right, we have heard for a long time, at least 70 years, that our regime is bent out of shape, that we don't live in the constitutional republic of early America. All manner of conservatives and right-leaning leaders have explained how Wilson changed things, how FDR changed things, how we have the rise of a large administrative state that's the fourth branch of government that doesn't really exist in the Constitution as you see it now. And so if the regime has been out of shape, right, the question is, how can the Constitution bend itself back? And I want to start with this thought, right? The right has this problem. How can you do that unless you wield the same amount of power as the form of the regime, right? If you did think about it as a physical form, like the structure of a car and it's bent out of shape, you need the same amount of power, right, that bent the metal to bend it back. Where's that going to come from? And the answer for increasing amounts of people is time-honored. It's old. When you have a populist movement, as you see in the US and in Europe, and you have a large, both sides argue, oligarchic system in many ways that's big, and there's a big bureaucracy everywhere sort of weighing everything down, you look for a leader. You look for one man. The people are powerful, but they're not powerful if they're not represented. How does the people concentrate their power? They concentrate it into, as every movie trailer tells you, one man in a world, right? So they look for the leader. You can see this happening in real time every day in the news. People are looking for that leader, and especially younger people are looking for someone who cuts through all of this nonsense and actually leads. It's a thirst. It's a yearning. You can see it all over the scene. And that's where I want to start. I mean, in order to actually bend the regime back, you would need someone who has regime-level power, let's call it, in their person. Now, of course, that presents another obvious problem, right? On the one hand, you need such power. On the other hand, as we know, such power is often misused. Washington himself once condemned the, quote, false ambition which desolates the world with fire and sword for the purposes of conquest and fame. And further, even when you use that power well to actually restore order and tranquility, justice and peace, which has happened in human history, this order and peace often dies with the man who wielded it. And then everyone fights, right, about who's going to be in charge and what happens next and what the regime form should be once again. So when you look at the examples of men who wielded such power, let's take Napoleon, Susan mentioned France, you often find these downsides mixed in with the glory and the good that they accomplish. Millions dead, Europe exhausted, turmoil at home, and a regime struggle once again. Now, the question would be, for every American, and especially for those who are trying to do something about the problem, and I speak a lot, I've spoken a lot over the last 10 years to younger leaders on the right about this. The problem is there an American example that they can turn to of this sort of figure who wields this kind of power. And I find it odd because I think a lot of students on the right, or the left has no problem saying, yes, transformational figure. A lot of students on the right sort of think there isn't an American example of this kind of thing, or if there is, they're not sure how it connects to the future of America in the 21st century. And so I'm going to start this out by confessing something to all of you right here and now. I'm going to confess my sins at this Catholic university. Washington, I never got Washington until about 10 years ago. I have a PhD in American government, political philosophy, studied all this stuff, read thousands and thousands of pages of the founding, which was terrible for getting academic jobs. No one cares. No one reads this stuff, but I was really into it, right? And Washington was still sort of a cipher to me until 10 years ago. He's sort of, he's the father of the country, but he's sort of a statue. He's maybe even kind of boring compared to the other founders. Because the other founders, their stories, right? I mean, Hamilton is one of the most colorful figures in all of human history. There's a musical that's been out about him, right? They're singing songs about him now. He has this amazing, tragic arc. Madison, he's one of the most ambitious men of his age. Madison is the mind, right? He writes the Constitution. He's studying regimes leading up until, reading old books and studying regimes leading up until the Constitutional Convention. Jefferson has the elegant words, right? Washington doesn't have the education. He's not a dumb man, right? He's not uneducated, but he's not formally educated. And he is not the wordsmith, although he does write a lot of his speeches. And he's not the mind, although he certainly agrees with Madison and shapes the Constitution in so many ways. So what is it about this guy? Why is he the father of your country? I want to start with something really simple. Let's just talk about what he looked like and how he moved around. Start with that before we get fancy. Thomas Jefferson, who had great taste, whatever else you might want to say about him, great taste in wines, great taste in all things. Jefferson said he was the foremost man on horseback of his age. Who here has ridden a horse? Oh, good, a fair amount. It's not easy, but it's also, if it's how you get around and everyone's doing it, there's an art form to that, right? It's more showy than driving a car. There's an art to it. He said he's the foremost man on a horse in his age, in a time when everyone's riding horses. That's a significant statement. That'd be kind of cool, even if you weren't a statesman, right, to have Tommy J say that of you. He also was a great dancer. In a more healthy time, I think, where there were less affairs rather than more, adults would get together and they'd all dance with each other. And all the women would want to dance with Washington, as one said, quote, to get a touch of him. He loved to dance, and he was a great dancer. His physical presence had an effect on people. To use the parlance of our time, he was a Chad Washington, right? I mean that in every sense of the term. It's important. Let's get a little bit more serious. What does this mean if we were just to go back in time and look at Washington interacting to figure out who he is? Let's first let's roll the tape. Let's look at the video of him and the people around him. There's a wonderful story, true story, documented a few times, about Gouverneur Morris and Alexander Hamilton and George Washington. Now, Gouverneur Morris is a forgotten founder, brilliant guy. He was influential in creating the office of the presidency, the Constitutional Convention. He pushed for strong executive power, and he was ambassador to France right after Jefferson, right before the Revolution. Some of his writings then are very, very good, very interesting. I mean, he's right there seeing what's going to happen. He predicts it all in fine form. He's a brilliant guy, but he's probably not as well known as the other founders, in part because of his personal problems. He made no bones about the fact that he liked to sleep around. He had a peg leg, and the rumor was that he received it because he was jumping out the window, a bedroom window, running away from an angry husband, and he got run over by a carriage in the street. I believe this is being recorded, but I'm going to say it anyway. John Jay said to this, "I sort of wish it run over another part of his body." And John Jay was about as Christian as they come, a good man, and he was like, no. So Morris was that kind of guy, but he was brilliant, and he was belligerent. And you have to think, these are all men, 25 to 35, who are some of the most, again, ambitious men of their age. Alexander Hamilton is known throughout the world during his life as being just that. And so Morris was talking one night, and he kind of says, look, Washington is so reserved and aristocratic, but I'm just as good a friend as anyone else to him, and I can be familiar with him. And Alexander Hamilton, of all people, looked at him and said, okay, that's fine, you made a dare. And he said something like, if you will, at the next reception, gently slap him on the shoulder and say, my dear general, I'm so very happy to see you. You look so well. The equivalent of, what's up, man? How's it going? Right? So the next evening at an early hour, Gouverneur Morris enters and shakes hands, puts his hand on Washington's shoulder and says, my dear general, I'm so very happy to see you. Look so well. And in one of the accounts of this, Washington withdraws his hand, steps back, fixes his eye on Morris with an angry frown, and Morris shrinks back. I always imagine that Homer Simpson meme into the green. He just sort of disappears, right? And this is serious, though. Morris says afterwards, I've won the bet, but I've paid dearly for it. Nothing would induce me to repeat it. In another version of the story, he says, I would never quail before any other. I don't just think that's a silly story. I think that if you've ever had to lead people in any fashion, you know that it's significant. How does he have this power? Morris is a bold man. He lives an idiosyncratic life. He doesn't care about propriety. He was the only one who dared to do such a thing, and yet he was ashamed. Why? The first thing that really gave me a clue was something Gouverneur Morris himself wrote once later in his life. And he's writing to John Marshall. John Marshall's sort of the youngest major founder. He's a kid the entire time. He immediately writes a biography very shortly after Washington dies, a biography of George Washington. And Morris reads the biography, and he sends this quote to John Marshall. In approving highly of your character of Washington, permit me to add that few men of such steady, persevering industry ever existed, and perhaps no one who so completely commanded himself. Thousands have learned to restrain their passions, though few among them had to contend with passions so violent. But the self-command to which I allude was of higher grade. He could, at the dictate of reason, control his will and command himself to act. Others may have acquired a portion of the same authority, but who could, like Washington, at any moment command the energies of his mind to a cheerful exertion? Now, Morris was someone who knew something about lack of self-control. That's why I trust him here, actually. He speaks boldly and I think perceptively. Let's examine what he says again. There's few men who have such steady, persevering industry, like the work ethic, like him, and there's no one who so completely commanded himself. Lots of people learn to restrain passions, but he had to restrain a passion of a higher grade. And once he knew the right thing to do, he could, at the dictate of reason, command himself to then do it even cheerfully. There's actually a lot packed in there. First off, think about something that's unremarked in our slovenly age. Someone who commands oneself is someone who does command respect. And you need to think about this, though, what exactly that means. Athletes in all times and places throughout history garner respect from societies, right? Any great athlete, they become stars in any society. Why? Look, as a lifelong Buffalo Bills fan, I might not like Tom Brady, right? But he's still the GOAT. Why do we respect Tom Brady? Because Tom Brady was a man who ordered everything in his life to winning football games. Normal people don't do that. Normal people don't order everything in their life to much of anything, right? He ordered everything in his life to something, and you could see it. You could see the excellence on the field. When you meet someone who has this kind of self-control, you gravitate towards them naturally. It is attractive, whether it's the physical body or whether it's some part of the soul. And it's not just because of beauty. I think there's a sort of self-command of everything in one's life that leads people to want to follow you. Once he saw what he was done, however, he did it. That's even bigger. When he sees what's to be done, he'll do it cheerfully. And this is remarkable. Morris says a lot of people learn to command themselves and do successful things, but it's remarkable because his passions, few had to contend with passions so violent. What is he talking about? What was the dark secret of George Washington? If you look at his life, he doesn't mean lust. He wasn't a philanderer. He doesn't mean greed. He doesn't mean envy. I believe that he refers to ambition. Washington did have violent passions. What was it? It was his desire to do great things. This is the older and better understanding of fame, which did not have to do with having your screen on your figure on the camera, right? It didn't have to do with being an influencer. It was to be known for doing great things, to do great things and be acknowledged for them. If he had a notable sin of the 7, it would probably be anger. You do not want to get on his bad side, especially when he was younger. And when he was younger, he also argued a lot with his superiors when he was in the military early on. He had to learn lessons there, made mistakes because he was driving so hard and so fast. Morris is saying he managed to channel that drive. And that's something worth meditating on in many ways in all of our lives. We'll return to that. But let me move from the opening remarks to tell you the story of a book. It's a book written in a very different time and place, 16th century Italy. Some of you just came back from Rome. There was a cardinal named Giovanni della Casa, and he wrote a courtesy book for those striving within the nobility amidst the court that was beginning to develop at the time. And it was a book for how you should act in fancy company and how civilized people should act in relationship to each other at a time when people were striving to become part of these expanding European courts. It became popular. It was translated from Italian into French and then into English. And hundreds of years later, a version of it, entitled The 110 Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior, was sitting in the wilds of the northeastern seaboard, and in some little schoolhouse, young George Washington wrote it all down in his own hand. And we still have that document today. It's always been, I think Americans have always realized there's something significant about Washington writing those things down because of his life that he was to live after. At the time, Americans were obsessed with these courtesy books that gave lists of morals and manners for people to follow. There was a hunger for a kind of hierarchy in the much more democratic colonies than there was in Europe. America didn't have the long-established institutions of Europe that maintained hierarchy and the relationships of people within society. And since Americans believed in a basic fundamental human equality, they were more democratic. They had to decide the standard by which you could rise above. They were looking for, everyone had a copy of these books, they were popular. They needed a set of morals and manners that would set people apart and tell them how to interact. There was just much more leeway, open space in the frontier to figure out what that should look like. So if we look at these rules that little George copied down, the first one is this: every action done in company ought to be with some sign of respect to those that are present. Every action done in company ought to be with some sign of respect to those that are present. So that's a sort of first principle. You could see Christian humanism in there, right? Because there's fundamental equality in here. If you're around other human beings, you have to acknowledge their presence in some way and comport yourself accordingly. That's the premise for all the rules. But there's also difference, right? Because you have to treat other people differently depending on who they are and the circumstance. And the rules are going to teach you how to do that. But you must treat of the other people. You owe them this, right? So that's sort of high and lofty. Everyone around you, every action done in company ought to be with some sign of respect to those that are present. But then how do you act? Well, you act differently in different situations, depending on different people's station and so on. The book is hilarious in this way, and you should read it if you never have, because the rules vary between sacred and profane. That lofty principle is number one. The second rule, not as lofty, says 2, when in company, put not your hands to any part of the body not usually discovered. It's often something you have to teach toddlers, you know. Here's a few more. Show nothing to your friend that may affright him. In the presence of others, sing not to yourself with a humming noise, nor drum with your fingers or feet. If you cough, sneeze, sigh, or yawn, do it loud, but not privately, and speak not in your yawning, but put your handkerchief or hand before your face and turn aside. So these are all extremely practical matters. It also, talks about spitting in public and that kind of thing. But throughout, it's how should you conduct yourself in the presence of other people, and the differences in how you should interact. So here's some more, a little bit more lofty. 86 is, in disputes, be not so desirous to overcome as not to give liberty to each one to deliver his opinion and submit to the judgment of the major part, especially if they are judges of the dispute. There's at least one person in every classroom that you want to read that one to. Let thy carriage be such as becomes a man grave and settled and attentive to that which is spoken. Contradict not at every turn what others say. That's why I contradict my teenagers all the time, just to provide balance in the force. Speak not evil of the absent, for it is unjust. It's essentially saying that gossip is immoral. But all these teach something practical about leadership or interacting with other human beings as well. So the list can seem maddening since it's full of things that you might consider trivial now, or people might consider trivial now, right next to things that seem quite important. But the fact that we think those two things don't go together shows a problem we have today, as well as something of the genius of who Washington was. The rules of civility, I said, cover manners and morals. However, for Americans in Washington's time, there's not really the distinction between those two things that you probably have in your mind today. If you look at Noah Webster's first dictionary, published in 1805, it's a great book. If you want to know what the founders meant by their words, you can just get Noah Webster's dictionary. You'll see that one of the definitions of manners is morals. The two words are interchangeable. They do mean something slightly different, but those things are connected. Today, we think of rules and manners as arbitrary, right? But in Washington's time, they knew that, of course, manners are arbitrary. You have to establish something, but they're not arbitrary in the greater picture, right? You need to establish habits and virtues that allow you to live well. And there's so many examples of this. I think that this is something about Washington that and the time that people want to return to, because when you get rid of those habits and you say that manners don't matter and they're not connected to morals, it's just my authentic inner self that needs to come out, and everything else is arbitrary. Everyone's rules, right? Your authentic self may be a terrible person, and we don't want to see it. You may need to work on it, harness it over time, and the way you would do that in their conception was to work on these little ways of being that help you grow. And you see the disaster of dating today is a good example, right? People in their 30s telling me I can't even find someone to get married to because everyone's so messed up. If there's no rules or customs at all, it makes things very awkward. As silly as the formal dance might seem at first glance, right, it's actually a way of de-awkwardizing the experience. If everyone has to dance with everyone, then everyone gets to dance, and you force everyone to interact, whether they want to or not. If you say there are no rules, you actually make for a situation that's even more awkward, and you have so many of the problems you see today. Dress code is the same way, right? Why does the shirt have to be this, or 2 inches over here? Why is this a problem? And drinking is the same way. If I'm driving drunk over to the University of Dallas from my house, and the cop pulls me over and I start to get philosophic and say, well, actually, there's no one point at which you can say someone's drunk. I mean, how can you say point to whatever? I'm a different person than that person, and I'm bigger and whatever. Of course, the rule is arbitrary, right? But the fact that there is a rule is not arbitrary. This is important because Washington is going to found America. And America now, at this point in time and during the founding period, does not have set rules and ways. It is a brand new country. What are those things? Usually those are inherited over many years. At the time, relative to other countries in Europe, it is disparate, diverse, big. What are we going to do? How do we live? All of that is important to politics. All of that is important to Washington's founding. So let's consider the last few rules, and we'll move on. It ends with these 4. First, if others talk at the table, be attentive, but talk not with meat in your mouth. I love that one so much. When you speak of God or his attributes, let it be seriously and with reverence. Honor and obey your natural parents, although they are poor. Think about that. There's inequality, right? You honor and obey your natural parents. There's a difference between you and them, and that wealth doesn't matter. We're talking about natural relationships where there are differences, right? Let your recreations be manful, not sinful. Labor to keep alive in your breast that little spark of celestial fire called conscience. And that's the last one. Notice this reference to conscience is you have to labor, you have to work to keep alive in yourself that little spark called conscience. You have to be working on yourself to keep that flame alive. And the 110 rules ends there. So this combination is essential to understanding Washington's greatness because it answers the question for Americans at the time, how is virtue to be embodied? You can talk about virtue, you can learn about virtue, you can repeat abstract words all day long. How do you live that? What does that look like? This is the question that he has to answer in so many ways over and over again. And personally, I think that, this is something that won't go away. You can't have sort of anarchy with these kinds of things. It will come back. And in America, even the image of the cowboy or, the private eye in the 1950s, it's a very American thing to admire someone who abides strictly by his own ethical code in the midst of moral anarchy. We admire that, and we are drawn to it, even still. So there's a much deeper purpose in this book. It's sort of a little path to virtue, and there's something about it that tells us about Washington. And you must realize this entire time, America is birthing itself, and it's trying to figure out what does this look like, this thing that we're building. There's a great book, I don't want to belabor this, but there's a great book called The Refinement of America by a man named Richard Bushman. It's a beautiful book, I think, and he talks about how Americans developed their manners and morality, from the time of Washington much further on. And the one example that I think is very instructive is, you guys read the Little House on the Prairie books? Has anyone read those? Yeah. Well, in these books, these people are in the 1800s, they're way out in North Dakota and far-flung places in the Midwest where the weather's awful and there's no electricity and life is tough. And in the middle of nowhere, in their little tiny house that they have to build, there is a parlor. And in the parlor, in the book, the girl kind of hates it and loves it. They can't go in the parlor normally. It's set aside. Only when guests come and on Sundays, they go in the parlor. You think about the waste of time and space, the efficiency that lacks when you have little space and you built this place and you can't even use this room in your little house. It's called Little House on the Prairie. Why? Because they set that apart for God and for guests. Parlor. Where's the parlor come from? That's a European word. That comes from the court. You're emulating aristocracy, that you would set aside something for music, for art, for God, and for hospitality. That's what's required to build civilization in the middle of nowhere. That's the discipline. And that is what is at the heart of George Washington. He's constantly having to figure out what things should look like. Okay, so after little George writes down these rules in a schoolhouse, he grows up. He's involved in land speculation. He's ambitious. He goes into service, in military service. He makes some mistakes. He's so high-strung and wants to move ahead. He learns some lessons, but he becomes a military hero. He becomes a military figure that is known throughout America. And we're going to move over some ground very fast just to focus on my main point about what you may not understand about George Washington. So he becomes the military hero. What happens? Well, these guys, this was a real rebellion. They would all be hung. They would likely lose their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor, right? They're going to lose it all. And it is a real rebellion. That's radical. That's a whole nother place to go. But he is known, they know even then, he is going to be the commander-in-chief. There's not much dispute about this. This is the man to lead us. So what happens next? Well, he doesn't have a real military. There is no American military. There is the British military. That has to be created. People have to volunteer to fight. Most of the time, the soldiers were not getting a paycheck, right? Because the Continental Congress was not sending them money. These are people who have left their wives and kids, who are running their farm up, and they've been gone for a year, 2 years. And he has to do what? Keep them together. I don't even want to focus on the military side of it, in which he was certainly brilliant, but he's not studied, throughout world history as the military tactician of the ages. He was no slouch. I want to focus on, I think the miracle of it was that he held all these men together. Why? How? By his presence, by being there, by what he said, and how he led them, how he cast a vision, and how he led them. Your livelihood is being destroyed. It's cold. You volunteered. You don't know if you're going to win, and you're not getting paid. Why are you going to stay? You're going to stay for the cause. But causes are abstract. They're embodied in leaders. He had to figure out how to keep them all in place. He had to convince them to trust they'd be compensated after all, and that they could win. And of course, they win that war. And what's the first thing that many of them think should happen next? Washington should obviously become the leader of America, and they should get what's theirs. The Continental Congress, by the way, is not even, we say a Congress because we respect Congress as it is today. Well, do we respect Congress? We respect the institution of Congress. Congress people, not so much. We respect the institution of Congress now, but the Continental Congress is really just the states sending a bunch of people to represent them. There's not a national government, right? So the idea is we should get what's ours, and he should go. And here again, when Washington quells this movement among his officers that they should take military power, he writes this speech. You can read what he writes, but he pauses to pull out his glasses, and he says, gentlemen, well, he's got the speech, and he says, gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country. His mere presence is moving enough that some weep at the thought of his sacrifice and the idea that they're rebelling against him. Even those who have no respect for the Continental Congress have immense respect for George Washington. And if he doesn't want them to do this, they're not going to do it. Maybe you already know this, but I'm going to say it anyway, and then I'm going to go into things that you probably haven't heard. It's clear to everyone at the time that, of course, if he wanted to, he could have taken power. But this is clear because it wouldn't be clear that it would be unjust to many people. He just won the war, right? We're free against the great empire. It's obvious that he could take power if he wanted to. When he makes known that he's going to go back to his farm, King George famously said, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. I'm going to give another example of a strong man, a ruler, who pays homage to Washington. But think about that. The king said, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. He does it, and the world echoes this sentiment. The world responds, saying he is a great man. We have not seen such things in our time, and it's rare in any time that someone would actually do this, imitate the great Roman Cincinnatus, and actually go back to the farm and not seek political power. That doesn't happen. As an American, you know it happened, and it's kind of like, oh yeah, that's what he did. People don't do this, right? People don't do this. When they actually get in that situation, they don't seize power and become tyrants. That's not how it works. They make an argument that it is just, fitting, right, and necessary for them to do so. And a lot of times, it's a pretty good argument. You could have made one then. So Washington rejects, some kind of throne or chair and goes back to the farm. But here's where I want to emphasize something that I think is neglected. And if I have a point today, it relates to this. After the Revolution, George Washington does not take power and become the undisputed leader of America. But he doesn't give it up either. In some way, it's impossible for him to give it up. He still has it. There is no other power in America that is greater than his. There's no other man as powerful as him. He has regime-level power. What does he do before he goes home? He doesn't just go back to the farm. He does something very important. He lays out a directive in 1783 in the circular to the states, to the entire nation. He tells the colonies what to do. And he does say, I'm preparing now to resign into the hands of Congress. I'm going to return to domestic retirement, which is well known. I left with the greatest reluctance, a retirement for which I've never ceased to sigh through a long and painful absence, and in which, remote from the noise and trouble of the world, I meditate to pass the remainder of my life in a state of undisturbed repose. That's never going to happen for him. I don't think that part of him wants it to happen because of the violent passion in which I said. I think he was a very ambitious man. But I also don't think he's lying here. He reminds me of Odysseus in the end of Plato's Republic, choosing a peaceful life after his peaceful life on the farm, after his life of commotion, of striving, of adventure, and of sorrow. In any event, in Washington's Circular to the States, he says, listen to what he's saying, and think about the stance from which he says it. Who could say such things with such authority? He says, there are 4 things which I humbly conceive are essential to the well-being, I may even venture to say, the existence of the United States independent power. And these are themes that start to be taken up in the debates very soon after in the Constitutional Convention. These are themes that are raging across America. What should we do? We just won the war. It's not clear what we are as a country. The first thing he says is we need an indissoluble union of the states under one federal head. He says this in 1783, well before the convention, of course. Second, we need a sacred regard to public justice. He talks here about paying debts after the war, which was a just thing for the government to do. You gotta pay your debts. Third, the adoption of a proper peace establishment. We still need a military. A military is essential for keeping peace. And fourth, the prevalence of that pacific and friendly disposition among the people of the United States, which will induce them to forget their local prejudices and policies to make those mutual concessions which are requisite to their general prosperity. And in some instances, to sacrifice their individual advantages to the interest of the community. We have to make sacrifices. We have to come together. We have to be one. We really need an indissoluble union of the states under one federal head, or this is going to work. He warns that if we don't do this, quote, we may find by our own unhappy experience that there is a natural and necessary progression from the extreme of anarchy to the extreme of tyranny, and that arbitrary power is most easily established on the ruins of liberty abused to licentiousness. He is worried about liberty being abused onto licentiousness, a kind of anarchy. Liberty means doing whatever we want. The states are all going to fight each other. The communities are going to fight each other accordingly. And that will lead, ladies and gentlemen, to tyranny, because you don't have that for long. Peace to all my anarcho friends. It's not a state that exists for long. You're happy to have Saddam Hussein coming in and take over if it prevents people from shooting you and people dying in the streets every day. And it's not even a bad thing, by the way. I mean, it's a natural. If you're a Christian in Syria under Assad, you might have no problem voting for Assad, even though you know he's a bad man, because you don't want your head chopped off by radical Muslims. That's just human nature, right? And they know this. They know this is a political principle. But the problem is, if you have licentiousness, you don't have order, you don't have a federal head, this is going to lead into a situation in which we will get a tyrant, and it's the opposite of what we wanted. This is the warning that we constantly hear from the founding generation. So, and it leads to the creation of the Constitution. He also doesn't shy away from religious language in the circular. He says this, and again, think about the stance from which you would say this. I now make it my earnest prayer that God would have you and the state over which you preside in his holy protection, that he would cultivate the hearts of the citizens, a spirit of subordination and obedience to government, and to entertain a brotherly affection and love for one another. At the end, he mentions the Christian virtues. He says to do justice, to love mercy, and to demean ourselves with that charity, humility, and pacific temper of mind, which were the characteristics of the divine author of our blessed religion. So note, he's not speaking as pastor or pope, but it's an exalted position from which he speaks. He is the leader. I mean, he is Napoleon in the sense that he won military victory and is the only undisputed leader in America at the time. He does not take power, but from a position of power, he instructs America about what ought to be done. Now, of course, Washington doesn't stay on the farm, right? It becomes clear there's a need for the convention. They already know this. The Articles of Confederation are a long, massive 12-year argument among the states. Nothing's ever clear with that. They've already tried once to change this thing and make it work. And the Federalists, his friends, are begging him to come. They're begging him to be there. Who are they? They're his guys. These are his guys. If he was CEO, these would be his executives, right? If he was a venture capitalist, this would be the team he put together to build the company. And they all know that this needs to be done. And so they want him to come because they know if he doesn't come, it won't happen. And if it does happen, it won't be taken seriously. His presence is required, once again. So after he's asked, Washington hems and haws, a while about going. And if you read scholars on this subject, which is often a terrible thing to do, but you should read some of them anyway, try. A lot of them, I don't think, take him seriously enough as a leader. I think people will say, he's hemming and hawing because he's concerned about his reputation. I've heard people say that. He's just very concerned about his reputation, so he's going back and forth like, oh, well, I'm George Washington, and like he's going to his PR agent. I don't know if you should go to this, George. It's kind of risky. If it fails, you won't be popular. But of course, that's not what's going on. Those people are very foolish. He knows that this is the chance to form the new government, and if he goes, it's giving his imprimatur to this, right? His imprimatur is coming down on this. This is him staking his claim on forming this regime. And in the end, he decides, of course, to go. So what does his power do here? It provides a place for deliberation. What does he do at the convention? He has to be there. He presides over it. He sits in front of them all, literally presiding over the body of people who debate. And he speaks twice at the convention, twice maybe, right? And that's it. And he doesn't speak at the convention. Now, of course, he's an active presence behind the scenes. His guys are coming back and forth to him, and they're angling to try to build the thing they want as they deliberate. But his presence is required. It makes it possible for the thing to be. What I would say is, and I think this is often a problem of the sorts of people who will end up, studying this stuff. They're crafts people, like a historian writes books, right? Scholars write books on their own with other scholars. But you have to think about this in terms of political reality or even business reality, right? What he's doing is much more like a CEO would do, right? Or an investor would do, saying, we got to come up with an idea for this company, like how are we going to do it? They don't have to be the guy, right, with the idea. That's not where their ego is. They know they're going to hire a bunch of smart people. They're going to shape it as best they can here and there, and those guys are going to figure it out. But if you don't have them in that room, that doesn't happen. And that's why sometimes we look at the people who write the documents, right, as the heroes. It doesn't happen without him being there. So what else? Another very important point about the convention before we leave it, right, is that as they're all sitting in that room, there is no doubt about who will be the first president. I mean, you can almost turn this a little cynical, like, oh, George Washington, who gave up power, the guy who presided over the convention to create the form of government of which everyone knew he was going to be the first leader. That was not just a giving up of power, right? Because they know he's going to be the first president, the Constitution itself looks different than it would otherwise. Because he was going to be the first president, and they all knew it, the presidency, the office of the presidency, executive power, is much stronger than it otherwise would have been. It made the argument for the Federalists much easier because, of course, you had a lot of people who just fought against the king, and they didn't like the idea of one person with power. They didn't like the idea of executive power. Some of the governors were the baddies who the king had appointed, and the Anti-Federalists, as they became known, attacked this. But it was hard to attack when George Washington was in the room because there's nothing bad you could say about him. You knew that he would be the first leader, and he deserved to and should be the first leader. And so the Constitution passes, and an enormous debate ensues across America, a raucous debate. Nonetheless, the Federalists have the upper hand. Why? It's very hard for the Anti-Federalists to attack Washington. They attacked everything about the Federalists, but they couldn't attack Washington in public. The closest they get is sometimes they say something like, they got one over on the old man. He's getting up there in age, and these young guys, they're a bad influence on them. That's the worst that they could say. And They could never attack his character. So he ends up taking power officially, and he becomes the first president of the United States. Now, no one knows what that means, right? No one knows what that looks like. The Constitution is a precious, beautiful, but short, mercifully, bunch of words on a piece of paper. What does this look like? How do we embody the form of the regime we just wrote in the abstract? What does it look like? What is it? Here's what he had done his entire life. When he's general, he's designing his officers' uniforms, and they didn't have any. And you read foolish people saying, oh, he must have been really into fashion, he's really into his image. No, if you've ever been in any hierarchical organization, you know these things matter. There is no military without uniforms designating rank and status, etc. These are very important things, and he had to start from scratch. There was nothing there. He had to give form to formless matter. He had to create order where there was not. So he knew he set an example for how things will operate throughout the course of those 2 terms. And again, if you think Lincoln had a team of rivals, think about what Washington had. I mean, Jefferson and Hamilton are going to grow to hate each other and start the two-party system. These were not men who disagreed. Think about who they were. You're dealing with future presidents in your cabinet. These are some of the most ambitious figures in American history, and you keep them tame and you keep them in line, and you use and harness their talent to actually embody what this regime is going to look like. Again, giving a lot of leeway to underlings, right? Using, as an executive would, their talent, but shaping it towards the good around the edges with the regime level power that he has. We should say one thing about the presidency before turning to the end. And that's the Thanksgiving Proclamation and the farewell address. So first, quickly, the Thanksgiving Proclamation is again important because of the position from which he is speaking. He is, again, not a pope. He's not a pastor. But he is speaking for the nation. And he says in this, the first Thanksgiving Proclamation, "It is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey his will, to be grateful for his benefits, and humbly to implore his protection and favor." He prays for help, but also forgiveness. He says also that we may then unite in most humbly offering our prayers and supplications to the great Lord and ruler of nations, and beseech him to pardon our national and other transgressions. That's a remarkable ask from a president of the United States. He's speaking as a spiritual leader. Again, not as a religious leader, but as the undisputed leader politically of America, to pardon us for our national and other transgressions. The prayer also points to the way law works in this, to render our national government a blessing to all the people by constantly being a government of wise, just, and constitutional laws. So God can bless the nation through the form of government, through the Constitution and our system of laws. This is the American system that I have just presided over the shaping of, and shaping and leading it now as president. We need God's blessing in this American system. I, George Washington, am telling you this. By the end of those 2 terms, he has founded America. He wins the battle against the British. He gives us independence. He gives us the Constitution, and he taught what it meant as the first formal leader of America as president. And then when he steps down, he does something like he did before when he stepped down. He gives us his farewell address. And what is he doing there? He's speaking as the founder, the undisputed political leader of America. He gives his final instructions to America. He explains how he thought the structure of our government could last. He does this with an eye to the citizens themselves, emphasizing how they need to come together and live as one, and he's also speaking to all the elites of his time, looking to where things are going. It's not just an old man speaking from a podium. He's using all the power he still possessed before he actually stepped down to steer the nation in the direction that he thought it should go. He's using his position to lay out that vision once again. And of course, he saw the lurking divide between North and South. He saw the danger in foreign affairs. It's a remarkable address that every American should read at least once a year. Of course, he also spoke about religion and morality, and I can't talk about George Washington without reading this, so you're going to have to forgive me. He says, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism, who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness. He was saying that religion and morality are not simply some arbitrary set of rules or a nice thing to have. He says that they are what it makes our form of government possible. The mere politician, equally with the pious man, ought to respect those pillars, he says. You will lose both private and public happiness if you subvert them. And he even makes a little dig, probably in my mind, aimed at Thomas Jefferson and the Thomas Paines of the world, when he says, whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. In other words, without religion, there can't be a moral society. Without moral society, you can't have the Republic of the United States of America. Now go tell that to everyone at Harvard and Princeton. Go tell that to many Americans. That's controversial. I don't even know if people on the right believe that today. He's saying you can't have this regime form unless you have religion and morality. So he goes on actually right after that to say, promote then as an object of primary importance institutions for the general diffusion of knowledge. All first 5 presidents wanted a national university that would morally educate the people. They were concerned about that moral and civic education and saw it as necessary. In any event, he ends his farewell address with these words. I am unconscious of intentional error, but I'm nevertheless too sensible of my defects not to think it probable that I may have committed many errors. Whatever they may be, I fervently beg the Almighty to avert or mitigate the evils to which they may tend. Again, speaking as founder, right? Speaking as founder. I also hope that my country will view them with indulgence, and that after 45 years of my life dedicated to its service with an upright zeal, the faults of incompetent abilities will be consigned to oblivion, as myself must soon be to the mansions of rest. I anticipate with pleasing expectation that retreat in which I promise myself to realize, without alloy, the sweet enjoyment of partaking in the midst of my fellow citizens the benign influence of good laws under our free government, the ever favorite object of my heart, and the happy reward, as I trust, of our mutual cares, labors, and dangers. There's much we could say about this. These are not just platitudes he's concluding with, but he is retiring. He wants to enjoy the benign influence of good laws that he has established with his fellow patriots. Of course, and with that, he steps down and he does go home. But if you're George Washington, you never really go home, and there never really is any real retirement. He dies not very long after 1799. For someone in his realm, there is no real end, and for him in particular, because when he goes to Mount Vernon, he would entertain guests, and this would happen many nights. And that's the opposite of retirement for many of us, right? Imagine if you had to entertain rotating guests at your house from all over the country, all over the world for dinner. And the way this would work is people would send letters to Mount Vernon asking if they could come and stay, and Washington would receive them and have dinner with them. And there's a wonderful little known story about one of these guests, not a famous guy, a young lieutenant who had been a soldier in the Revolution. And I only found this in this great book by a great historian, because he likes to tell stories. Good historians actually like to tell stories. It's crazy. I don't know. Ask Herodotus. It's a very great book, and it's good for your ADHD too, because Founders and the Founders is this big, but it's nothing but short snippets of founders on the founders. So sometimes they're talking smack about each other, other times they're praising each other. It's very interesting. It's something you could actually pick up and enjoy. In any event, we wouldn't know about this. This is just buried in some guy's journal who's not well known at all. And he was a veteran. He was very young during the Revolutionary War, and so he was able to gain entrance to Mount Vernon. And when he arrived, he had a bad cold. He was clearly sick at the dinner table. And people were trying to encourage him to drink some soup and get some rest so he could recover. But of course, as you do if you're a young man in that situation, you say, no, I'm fine. Don't worry about it. Please move on. You're embarrassing me. And he records in his diary that later that night, he hears a knock on the door. And he opens the door, and there was the great General Washington with a cup of soup, because he knew the soldier would not refuse him. And the soldier writes down, I just wanted to write down that he did that for me. George Washington. So we will make of all this. The founders understood that there was a desire in certain souls for fame and glory. And they also knew that it was necessary to harness that desire, to order it towards the good of all. Right? The tyrant rules for himself. The good ruler rules for the sake of the common good of the society. So they knew that there was a tension, always and everywhere, between harnessing that desire for greatness, for the good of all, and using it for the good of oneself. When you observe Washington's life, you see this unwavering quest to create a stable order that would outlast himself. You see it in every part of his life, many of which I just described above, from establishing order within himself in the rules of civility, to thinking about uniforms and how they looked, his service in the war, the convention, his presidency, and even his retirement was all dedicated to creating and preserving an order that would outlast him. His silence is often telling. As I said, it's hard for some people to understand how he was the leader when they don't sort of see him leading by writing words and arguments, right? But as I say, even a good venture capitalist or CEO operates in this way. They find, shape, and lead the best talent. They don't need to make the whole plan themselves, to write the documents, to do all those things. They put it all together and guide it forward and shape it. And I would say that the highest level of this sort of virtue in human affairs outside of the church, whose true leader is also Christ, is that the founder and political leader wielding regime-level power in the manner that Washington did. I would say that Washington never simply spurned power. He never let it go. He wielded it to form an order greater than himself, an order that would long outlast him. And if you don't believe me, consider the words of an exiled Napoleon on Washington. I find them very interesting. He says, when I acquired the supreme direction of affairs, it was wished, when he came to power, it was wished that I might become a Washington. Words cost nothing, and no doubt those who were so ready to express the wish did so without any knowledge of the times, places, persons, and things. People who say that don't know the circumstances. Had I been in America, I would willingly have been a Washington, and I should have had little merit in so being, for I do not see how I could have reasonably acted otherwise. But had Washington been in France, exposed to discord within and invasion from without, I would have defied him to have been what he was in America. At least he would have been a fool to attempt it and could only have prolonged the existence of evil. For my own part, I could only have been a crowned Washington. It was only in a congress of kings, in the midst of kings, yielding or subdued, that I could become so. Then and there alone, I could successfully display Washington's moderation, disinterestedness, and wisdom. I could not reasonably attain to this, but by means of the universal dictatorship. To this I aspired. Can that be thought a crime? Napoleon has a point. Circumstances matter greatly. I make no judgment on Napoleon. I only wish to point out to you that Napoleon recognized the standard that Washington set. He recognized that it was a standard to which the greatest leaders in world history would forever be measured. If you go to the Capitol of the United States of America, has anyone been to the Capitol? Directly below the rotunda, you find yourself in what is still called the crypt. Do you know this? In the center of that room, beneath the rotunda of the Capitol, you will find a marble star on the floor marking the very center of the District of Columbia. George Washington was supposed to be buried there. After he died, Congress passed a resolution to bury him in that spot. Now, he had no children. The just fame that Washington sought, the just acknowledgement for noble deeds that's possible in this life, is to be remembered after one's death. It would be fitting if he was, in fact, buried there. And of course, for anyone who's ever been enamored of the glory that flows from power, it would be the ultimate testament of power to be buried there in the very heart of the capital city. But one might say there was a third time Washington returned or stayed on his farm. After many plans to move his body, his family ultimately kept to his express wish in his will that his remains would rest in Mount Vernon. Now the crypt is empty. The nation founded, his bodily presence was and is no longer needed. Yet, the city that bears his name, Washington, D.C., is now the most powerful city on earth. I think all those with ears to hear should hear that and meditate upon it and his life. And may all the rest of us in this 250th anniversary of these United States strive to better establish a form of government and American way of life in the 21st century worthy of his name. Thank you.